The Pope owns more than God. Benito Mussolini, Rome, March 1929. Tuesday, June 9th, 2015, 9:46 a.m. Rome time. The morning bells echoed through St. Peter's Square as tourists took photos beneath a sky so clear it almost looked unreal. Across the cobblestone courtyard, a white-suited cardinal stepped into a black car with tinted windows. That same morning, across the world in Manhattan, a sealed indictment was being prepared, linking offshore accounts, a Maltese passport, and a Vatican investment property in London that was never meant to be seen. No arrests were made. No press conference followed. The headlines barely whispered it. But something had shifted. For over 2,000 years, the Vatican has stood as a symbol of mercy, sacrifice, and salvation. But behind its marble walls, a very different history has been written. One that isn't told in Sunday homilies. Billions, yes, billions, move through the smallest country on earth, untaxed, unquestioned, untouched. There are vaults beneath churches. There are documents sealed not just by locks, but by deathbed oaths. There are priests who once held rosaries and briefcases. And yet, if you ask the average pilgrim walking into the basilica today, they would tell you the church is rich in spirit, not in gold. But numbers don't lie. In 1982, a body was found swinging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. His name was Roberto Calvi, known in financial circles as God's banker. He was the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, a bank with ties to the Mafia, Freemasons, and the Vatican. His pockets were filled with bricks, his neck broken. There was no funeral in the Vatican, no mourning for the man who helped shift millions for them through secret accounts in Switzerland, Panama, and Luxembourg. Only silence. You see, to understand how the church became one of the wealthiest empires in human history, you can't start with Jesus. You can't even start in the Bible. You have to start with power. You have to start with a land deal. You have to start with a lie. That became law. This is the untold history of how faith was used not only to save souls, but to build a financial empire, where prayers were offered in public and fortunes were built behind closed doors. This is not just a story about religion. It's a story about the cost of silence and the currency of power. It began with a signature. Rome, February 313 AD. The Edict of Milan, signed by Emperor Constantine, did more than end the persecution of Christians. It unlocked the gates of imperial favor and opened the church to something it had never known before: land, power, and the legal right to own both. Almost overnight, Christian bishops were no longer fugitives or outcasts. They were administrators, governors, stewards of real estate. Across the empire, noble families donated villas, farms, vineyards, and coin to secure blessings, forgiveness, and favor in the afterlife. But it wasn't just faith that motivated these gifts, it was strategy. Aligning with the church became a way to hedge against political instability, and the church accepted relentlessly. By the end of the 4th century, the bishops of Rome had become some of the wealthiest landholders in Italy, and yet a deeper layer of authority would come through something far less holy. A document known as the Donation of Constantine surfaced in the 8th century. It claimed the Roman emperor had granted supreme spiritual and temporal power to the Pope, transferring dominion over Rome and the Western Empire to the Church. That document was used for centuries as the legal foundation for the Pope's right to rule lands, not just churches, but entire territories. Historians later exposed it as a forgery. But it didn't matter. The damage or advantage was done. In the eyes of kings and emperors, the Pope was no longer just a shepherd of souls. He was a ruler, a landowner, a monarch. The 8th century saw the formal birth of the Papal States, stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic coast. It became a theocracy carved into the Italian peninsula. From 756 to 1870, the Pope wasn't just the head of the Catholic Church. He was a sovereign over armies, citizens, treasuries, and laws. Taxes were collected, peasants were tithed. Whole villages worked church land without ever touching it. monasteries became economic powerhouses, absorbing lands through wills, donations, and quiet pressure. If a farmer died without an heir, the church would claim his land as spiritual inheritance. If a noble sought redemption for past sins, his estate might become a monastery overnight. Over time, the church began to rival regional lords, not only in holiness, but in wealth and influence. And the people? They paid. They paid in coin, grain, livestock, labor, and loyalty. The concept of indulgences grew in the Middle Ages, not as a spiritual expression of penance, but as a transactional reality. Forgiveness could be purchased, so could speedier entry into heaven. For a price, the money flowed upward, the burden stayed below, but perhaps nothing revealed the church's financial machinery like the Crusades. Beginning in 1095, they were billed as holy wars, but they were also heavily financed. Landowners mortgaged their estates. Knights paid entry fees to join the cause. The church promised spiritual rewards in exchange for financial ones. Loans were issued, tolls collected, and in return, the church gained leverage across Europe. Territories were granted. Military orders like the Knights Templar grew into global banking systems. The Crusades were not just about reclaiming Jerusalem. They reshaped the church's influence in trade, territory, and diplomacy. And through it all, the church maintained one advantage no kingdom could rival: immunity from taxation. While kings taxed peasants and merchants, the church stood exempt. Not a single coin from cathedral revenues went to secular lords. Instead, it was reinvested into property, art, politics, and occasionally war. That immunity meant permanence. While empires rose and fell, the Vatican's wealth never faced royal hands or state seizure. It only grew. By the end of the 13th century, the church was no longer just a spiritual force. It was a land empire, a court of law, a lender, a power broker. The gold of salvation had found its earthly vaults, and in time, those vaults would need stewards, bankers, and guards, not just priests. Florence, June 24th, 1478. In the heart of the city, as bells rang out for the feast of St. John, a banker's son stood on a balcony above a packed street. His name was Lorenzo de' Medici. Below him, bishops, merchants, and nobles stood shoulder to shoulder. Some came for worship, others for favors. But all of them knew something unspoken. Lorenzo wasn't just the ruler of Florence. He was the banker of the Pope. The Medici family didn't rule by the sword. They ruled with paper, ledgers, interest rates, loans. Their banking dynasty stretched across Europe, and their strongest account belonged to the Catholic Church. The papacy, hungry for funds to build its growing empire of stone and gold, found in the Medici a perfect partner. At a time when charging interest was technically forbidden by church law, the Medici found ways to work around the rules. They labeled profits as fees, moved funds through branches, and paid off the right hands. Their financial empire helped construct cathedrals, finance cardinal elections, and sponsor religious festivals that were as much political as they were holy. Gold flowed both ways. Church funds were held and managed by the Medici Bank, giving them unprecedented access to the heart of the Vatican. In 1513, that access became absolute. Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici was elected Pope, taking the name Leo X, and with his papal ring came the keys to the treasury. Under Pope Leo X, the church's wealth was spent faster than it was collected. Balls, feasts, artists, wars. The money poured into personal prestige, grand architecture, and displays of power that reached far beyond the Vatican walls. In just a few years, Leo's spending outpaced revenue by such extremes that even the church's vast lands and tributes couldn't keep up. And when gold grew scarce, indulgences grew plentiful. The church offered written certificates promising shortened time in purgatory for a price. These weren't just symbols of spiritual mercy. They were products, marketed across Europe with urgency. The money they brought in funded basilicas and art, but they also funded debts. And in 1517, in a small town in Saxony, A monk named Martin Luther watched as these indulgence preachers arrived, promising forgiveness for sale. What he saw wasn't divine, it was transactional. That October, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. Many think of it as a spiritual protest, but at its core, it was a reaction to a financial scheme. Luther wasn't just attacking theology, he was calling out a corrupt revenue model. The idea that a soul's fate could be altered with a coin was something he could not accept, and he wasn't alone. Across Northern Europe, rulers saw an opportunity. Breaking from Rome meant they could reclaim lands, stop the financial outflow, and assert their own authority. The Reformation wasn't only a religious shift, it was an economic rupture. The church lost its grip on huge portions of Europe. And with it, they lost the income, the lands, and the unquestioned influence they once held. But instead of reforming their financial methods, the Vatican responded by strengthening them. If the North was gone, then Rome would become stronger, more centralized, more guarded, and more willing to bend the definition of faith when finances were at stake. What had begun as a humble community of believers had, over centuries, become a financial powerhouse. A system where forgiveness could be purchased, loyalty could be rented, and even the highest office in the church could be won, if one had the right backers. The Renaissance gave the church its greatest art and some of its most dangerous habits. And as gold filled the chapels, cracks began to show beneath the marble. By the time Leo X died, the Vatican was in debt. But its methods of maintaining wealth through banking families, interest games, indulgences, and silence remained deeply intact. Because by then, the church had learned a new truth. Salvation may be free, but empires are not. February 11th, 1929. It was just past noon in the Apostolic Palace when Cardinal Pietro Gasparri and Benito Mussolini put ink to parchment. The room was quiet. The cameras outside were not. With the stroke of a pen, the Lateran Treaty was signed, ending decades of bitter tension between the Italian state and the Catholic Church. In exchange for the Vatican's public recognition of fascist Italy, Mussolini agreed to pay the church 750 million lire in cash and government bonds, an amount that would today be worth billions. It wasn't just compensation, it was a bargain. With that money, the church regained not just legitimacy, but independence. The Vatican City-State was born, a 109-acre nation with its own postal system, radio station, diplomatic corps, and most importantly, no external oversight, no taxes, no audits, no borders to cross when moving money. In less than a year, the Pope went from being a religious leader without a country to a sovereign figurehead at the helm of a financial and political fortress. The Vatican now had statehood, and with it, the immunity and reach of any modern government. But the story didn't stop there. 4 years later, on July 20th, 1933, another treaty was signed. This one between Pope Pius XI and Adolf Hitler's new regime. It was called the Reichskonkordat. The church agreed to stay out of German politics. In return, Catholic institutions were protected. Schools would remain open, property rights would be honored, pulpits would stay sacred. But something else was exchanged, something quieter. While swastikas were rising across Europe and political parties were being dismantled, the Vatican said nothing publicly. Priests were silenced, bishops were moved. The Holocaust had not yet begun, but the signs were impossible to miss. Still, the Vatican maintained neutrality. It did not speak out. It did not walk away. Instead, while Hitler consolidated power, Catholic networks continued to operate, trusted, overlooked, and in some cases exploited. Nazi officials and their collaborators found ways to channel looted assets, gold, jewelry, foreign bonds, through religious organizations. Some were hidden under charities. Others moved through dioceses and monasteries. And in the Balkans, the Croatian Ustaše regime carried out brutal ethnic purges, while their stolen wealth found safe passage through church-run routes. Survivors spoke of priests on trains, of gold teeth melted into coins, of records that vanished. Meanwhile, the Vatican said very little. It held firm to its role as a neutral power, even as those around it were burned out of their homes, marched into camps, or disappeared entirely. And while the world focused on the front lines, the Vatican focused on structure. In 1942, at the height of World War II, the Church formalized its financial operations with the creation of the Institute for Works of Religion, known today as the Vatican Bank. It was not just a place to hold money, it was a sovereign financial institution, accountable to no foreign government, reporting to no central bank. With its own rules, its own secrecy, and its own agenda. Over time, it would handle billions in assets. Some of those accounts were legitimate: mission funds, charitable donations, pension reserves. But others were murkier. Through a maze of offshore fronts, shell companies, and coded ledgers, the Vatican Bank became one of the most protected financial entities in the world. And it all began with those early deals, with fascists and dictators, with autocrats who offered land, money, and silence in exchange for legitimacy. The Church did not just survive fascism, it profited. It expanded. It redefined itself as a power not only of the spirit, but of the state. And in doing so, it embraced a strategy that would echo through the coming decades. Work with anyone who protects the Church's interests, and speak only when speaking serves them. The Vatican City State, born from Mussolini's need for credibility, had now become untouchable. And the Vatican Bank, built on a promise of trust, had become an international strongbox without a key. What began as peace treaties were, in practice, blueprints. Blueprints for wealth, control, and silence. Blueprints that would shape everything that followed. June 18, 1982. The body of a man was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. His pockets were stuffed with bricks. His neck was broken. His name was Roberto Calvi. To the public, he was a respected banker. To those behind closed doors, he was called God's banker. He was the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, Italy's second largest private bank, and the unofficial financial arm of the Vatican. For years, Calvi moved millions across continents using shell corporations, ghost charities, and secret accounts. Behind the paper trail were drug cartels, offshore mafias, and political slush funds, all hiding behind a curtain of Catholic respectability. At the center of it all sat the Vatican Bank, formerly known as the Institute for Works of Religion. It operated without oversight, without external regulators, and with the full protection of a sovereign state. Inside its walls, secrecy was not a policy. It was a rule. One man managed the Vatican's financial engine during its most controversial years. His name was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, an American, tall, brash, and unapologetic. He spoke like a corporate CEO, operated like a fixer, and ran the bank like it was his private empire. Under Marcinkus, the Vatican Bank was more than a vault. It became a player. It moved money into real estate across Europe and the Americas. It invested in oil ventures and pharmaceutical giants. It funneled funds through Luxembourg, the Bahamas, and Panama. In some cases, those investments helped schools and hospitals. In others, they helped no one but the men who managed them. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed in 1982, it left behind missing billions, shredded ledgers, and a hole that reached into Vatican accounts. Calvi's death was ruled a suicide at first. Then, investigators found no rope fibers on his neck. They discovered his hands had never touched the bricks. The British reopened the case. The Italians called it murder. Masonic ties, mafia debts, political blackmail. It all converged on that bridge. But no one was ever convicted. The Vatican denied responsibility. Marcinkus avoided trial, shielded by diplomatic immunity as a citizen of Vatican City. He quietly left Rome in the early 90s and moved to Arizona. He never faced formal charges, but the damage was done. The world began to ask, what exactly is the Vatican Bank hiding? In the decades that followed, more questions surfaced. Between the 2000s and 2010, whistleblowers and leaked documents exposed a network of offshore entities tied to the Vatican. They found hidden accounts in Switzerland, properties in London, Paris, and Buenos Aires, investments held through private firms, some of which were owned by laymen with criminal records. One set of files showed donations meant for charity being diverted into luxury apartments. Another showed transfers that bypassed anti-money laundering checks entirely. The Vatican responded with statements of commitment, task forces, new watchdog offices. But scandals kept coming. In 2012, leaked letters from inside the Vatican revealed infighting, power struggles, and fears over financial collapse. A year later, Pope Benedict XVI became the first pope in 600 years to resign. The official reason was age and health, but insiders whispered about files placed on his desk, dossiers containing details of corruption so deep, so entangled in high-ranking circles, that confronting it would shatter the Church's image. When Pope Francis was elected in 2013, he made cleaning up Vatican finances a core mission. He called for transparency, froze accounts, and commissioned audits. He invited outside experts to trace decades-old trails of missing funds. Some accounts were closed, some were restructured, but many within the Curia pushed back. Reform met resistance not with speeches, but with delays, obstacles, quiet transfers, and internal politics. Pope Francis removed some key officials. Others simply vanished from the Vatican stage. In 2020, the Vatican confirmed a financial loss of over $100 million in a single London property deal. A deal traced back to years of unchecked investments. Lawsuits followed. One cardinal was stripped of his privileges. Investigations expanded across borders. But the truth is, for decades, the Vatican Bank was a fortress built on autonomy and silence. It answered to no state. It kept no public books. It allowed a unique kind of immunity, one born from faith, shielded by law, and strengthened by centuries of tradition. The Church did not just hold wealth, it moved it, multiplied it, and at times hid it. Whether for God, for charity, or for power is a question that still lingers. The bank built to serve the faithful became something else, a power too sacred to question, a ledger too complex to audit, a vault that locked more than gold. December 8th, 2022, 7:12 a.m. Rome time. The sun rose over St. Peter's Basilica as a small group of cardinals entered a private meeting behind closed doors. No cameras, no statements. The topic, according to sources close to the Curia, was money. Not just donations or operating budgets, but assets. Global real estate portfolios, luxury apartments, vast art collections, investment holdings in oil, insurance, and blue-chip corporations. Some estimates place the Catholic Church's total wealth in the hundreds of billions. Others say the real number is impossible to calculate because so much is spread across dioceses, foundations, and ancient trusts. In London, the Church owns entire city blocks. In Spain, thousands of properties have been quietly claimed under old laws that give the Church legal advantage. In the United States, parishes hold farmland, rental buildings, and prime real estate, all protected under religious tax exemptions. But wealth isn't just in land. Within the Vatican museums are masterpieces by Michelangelo, Raphael, Caravaggio, priceless, untouchable, and entirely off the market. In financial circles, the Vatican is seen not just as a spiritual institution, but as a sovereign fund disguised in robes. Yet unlike other world powers, there are no public shareholders, no national elections, no external audits. Pope Francis has acknowledged this problem. Since 2013, he's pushed for reform with the weight of the papacy behind him. He created new financial watchdog offices. He restricted cash flows. He ordered transparent accounting. He called for the closure of secret accounts and fired bishops caught hiding funds. But every step forward has been slow, fragile, and met with resistance. Not from the public, but from within. Behind the Vatican's gates are centuries of habit, of privilege, of silence passed down like relics. Pope Francis has warned his own ranks that the Church is not a business, but it operates like one. And sometimes Even he admits it struggles to remember what it was built for. Critics have asked a question that refuses to go away. If the church truly stands with the poor, why does it sit on this much wealth? Why not sell one palace, auction one painting, lease one corner of its empire, and use the money to feed the dying, house the homeless, or heal the forgotten? Supporters respond with a different view. The church, they argue, is a custodian. It preserves sacred art. It maintains global missions. It operates schools, clinics, and shelters in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. To liquidate its legacy would be to betray it. But that answer has not satisfied everyone. In Argentina, Brazil, Congo, India, priests in broken churches ask for help and receive silence. In Europe, legal settlements for abuse survivors are delayed, not for lack of guilt, but for lack of budget. The Vatican Bank has been restructured, but its past remains sealed in archives. Millions were spent, some for good, some never explained. This is the moment where history meets conscience. The church has walked with kings, dictators, and presidents. It has held power without borders and money without taxes. It has spoken for the voiceless and silenced its own when needed. It has lived as a kingdom and preached as a ministry. The question now is simple. If wealth is where your heart is, where does that leave the church?